The BBC on the 26th of November. Quote, District Judge Bryony Clark ruled that the complainant, Brooks, was not giving entirely truthful evidence during the trial in September, while Linehan was generally a credible witness. End quote. Meanwhile, back in September, quote, Linehan added, You're trying to make out I'm a bigot because I believe in women's rights and oppose men trying to intimidate and bully women. He said Ms. Brooks had been involved in trans activism since 2013. Prosecutor Julia Foray Walker said Ms. Brooks would have been 6 years old at the time. So he says, Linehan replied. Ms. Foray Walker said that Ms. Brooks' driving license proves she is 18. If you can lie about your name and sex, you can lie about anything, Linehan replied. End quote. Oh yeah, real bloody credible. And yet, this warped notion was used to excuse Linehan from the consequences of his own actions. But that's why we call it the legal system and not the justice system, because it exists not to enact justice but to protect bigots and child nonces, including Graham Linehan. And yes, I will absolutely provide evidence of why I consider Linehan a child abuser and label the actions of District Judge Bryony Clark to be a blatant miscarriage of justice, allowing you to make up your own mind. But first, a quick content warning for the following: sexual harassment of children, assault, victim blaming, transmisia, and misgendering. If our work has helped you, please consider supporting us via Patreon so we can keep the channel running. You can also help us by liking, commenting, and sharing our work on social media. I'd also just like to take this time to remind our viewers that the statements made throughout our videos are the opinions of myself, the host, based on the evidence I have available to me. They are not and should not be taken as unquestionable fact, which is why we reference everything, because we're fallible. Thus we strive to give you, the viewer, the ability to check all evidence yourself in order to make up your own mind, which is what the reference numbers in the top left corner are for, being numbers that match up with the reference list found in the transcript linked down below. As such, we encourage all viewers to do their own research to reach an informed conclusion about the topic. Hi there, mine's Ethel Thurston, she, her, they, them, and we need to talk about the way the UK courts have decided to shield Graham Linehan, someone caught on camera attempting to sexually degrade a then 17-year-old girl in public, from justice, as well as the prejudice that sadly made this verdict all too predictable. Starting with the incident itself, which took place at the Battle of Ideas Festival on the 19th of October 2024. Linehan saw our victim, Sophia, standing in line and approached her, berating her, calling her an incel, which is when the following recording took place.
Graham,
disgusting.
you're disgusting,
little
Graham, you're divorced.
sissy porn watching scumbag.
And you're calling me the groomer
There
when
you go,
you're
mate.
assuming.
See you soon.
Bye, Graham.
So we have a 56-year-old man approaching a 17-year-old trans girl, labelling her disgusting and accusing her of watching sissy porn in an attempt to, rather clearly, sexually degrade her. And Linehan knew Sophia was a teenager, contrary to what he asserted in court, as seen in posts he made the day after the incident, referring to her as a quote-unquote psycho posh kid and a quote-unquote 17-year-old sociopath. Isn't it interesting how his story changed to deny her age after the papers began reporting on the matter? The reason he approached Sophia in the first place was his ongoing harassment and stalking campaign, obsessively posting about said 17-year-old after Trans Kids Deserve Better released crickets into a fascist conference attended by numerous paedophiles and paedophile romanticizers, including Joanne Cataline Rowling, with Linehan asserting, without evidence, that Sophia was responsible. We have a video on said conference if you'd like to know more. Point is, this wasn't a in-the-moment act, this was part of a wider pattern of abuse and harassment. But returning to the video itself, this is conduct of a sexual nature which had the purpose of violating 17-year-old Sophia's dignity, attempting to create an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, and offensive environment for her. That is, in my mind, a clear-cut example of sexual harassment, on camera, making Graham Linehan guilty of sexual abuse against a teenager, a child. Do note, this is a moral judgment, not a legal one. I am not a lawyer nor a judge. I know sexual harassment law primarily tackles workplaces, positions of care, and public services. I also know the limitations regarding the age of sexual consent in the UK, as it is a fucked up country, also seen in how its rape laws limit rape to penetration by a penis. Point is, the law in the UK as currently exists is unjust, thus I reject it as having any real authority on the matter. What matters to me is that Graham Linehan sexually abused a 17-year-old on camera, something any reasonable person can see and recognize. To defend Linehan by denying said sexual abuse is to defend sexual abuse, specifically of a teenager. And I think he knows this, as seen in his reaction when Sophia pointed out his hypocrisy on the groomer remark, leading him to turn tail and run away. He accuses Sophia, a child, of being a child predator, while sexually degrading her, only to be called out on what he was doing then and there. It also shows how Linehan was the one who approached Sophia as she waited in line, not the other way around. Yet it got worse when Linehan went on to physically assault Sophia, lunging at her to grab her phone before throwing it on the ground. A fact we only know of because he boasted on Twitter, confessing as he declared that he was, quote, "quite proud that I grabbed his phone and threw it across the road. He was furious." End quote. So this wasn't a "I lashed out and immediately regretted it." This was a "I'm proud of my actions and stand by them even after I've had 3 days to consider them," during which I acknowledged that Sophia was just 17 years old. Yet, even more worryingly, Linehan attempted to gain access to Sophia's private information, with Linehan tweeting out to his 500,000 followers that, quote, "We believe Tarquin is studying computer science somewhere in London. If you know him and want to help stop him harassing people, please get in touch." End quote. Tarquin is the silly fucking name he began calling Sophia for some random reason. But can you even begin to imagine just how terrifying that must have been for Sophia? If even one person who went to her college and thus knew and recognized her had also been a supporter of Linehan, the man who had been harassing her could have gained access to her private information, potentially doxing her to his 500,000 followers. That is a terrifying situation to be put in. Rather naturally, we reported on the incident when it first happened, calling for the trans community to rally behind Sophia however they could. Yet, that was where we thought things would end, legally speaking. We had zero trust in the British legal system to even attempt to take things further. Which is why we were taken by surprise when news broke that Linehan had been officially charged on the 26th of April 2025, a whole half a year later. So we produced a follow-up video going over what we knew about the charges along with a few other details that had come out since our original piece. Now, we ended up privating both videos due to the way that the UK courts operate when it comes to mistrials, as was pointed out to us. We knew Sophia was already fighting an uphill battle and decided that our coverage should not jeopardize the already slim chances she had at justice. So we privated both videos. They are now back up, publicly available, as the trial has concluded. The two charges filed against Linehan were harassment of Sophia Brooks for both the incident and the post he made between the 11th and the 27th of October 2024, including the one in which he tried to source Sophia's private details, along with the charge of criminal damage of Sophia Brooks' mobile on the 19th of October. The trial itself began in September with both parties presenting evidence, which is where the quote about Sophia's age came from. And we'll get back to that during discussion on the judge's conclusions, but I just wanted to talk about Linehan's primary defense for his actions, namely that quote, he told police the teenager had taunted him over the very sensitive subject of his separation, Westminster Magistrates Court, heard this morning," end quote, with the article going on to add, quote, "I had to try to ignore Sophia as much as possible, but when he confronted me again at the end of the conference, Sophia, frustrated at not having been able to get some form of reaction from me, then made a provocative statement about my current family position. I am divorced, and this was a very sensitive subject for me, as he well knows. The taunting was completely unnecessary, as was the filming, and in response I grabbed the phone and threw it to one side. I am sure that this is precisely the response he had wanted, so he could complain about me. However, I had had enough of the continued harassment and needed to stop him taunting me any further. It was a reflex response to provocative actions from Sophia. I have been informed his actions are sufficient for me to complain to the police about harassment from Sophia. However, I have no wish to do that and simply wish for harassment from Sophia to stop." End quote. Problem is, Linehan has made his divorce a pitiful rallying cry, bringing it up in article after article in a sad attempt to steal sympathy from his victims, of which there are many, myself included. It is a political tool to him, a bludgeon designed to force everyone to feel sorry for the fact that he's been made to suffer the entirely predictable consequences of his own actions. Hell, he even made this argument in court, as acknowledged by the judge in section 56 of the ruling. Linehan constantly uses the insult incel, meaning involuntary celibate, framing trans people as these lonely creatures devoid of love. And whilst we didn't hear it in the clip earlier, Linehan did call Sophia an incel multiple times throughout their exchange, including in the lead-up to that clip. That is why the topic of his divorce came up, as a direct response to that provocation on his part. I've actually experienced this very same thing firsthand, with Linehan trying to label me an incel on one of my videos after he failed to threaten us with a lawsuit, only for me to remind him that, out of the two of us, only one of us gets to cuddle her wife every night. Point is, Sophia's response was a perfectly valid reaction, calling out the sad bigot for his hypocrisy, his clear projection. Yet Linehan acts as if he alone is allowed to bring his divorce up as a political tool and degrade others based on their supposed inability to find or keep a partner. So, 2 counts of one rule for me and another for thee. But that was his primary justification for his actions, that a 17-year-old girl turned a portion of his own vitriol against him, and that, unlike him, she had evidence to back up her claims that he was a lonely sack of shit. Sadly, none of this seemed to matter to District Judge Brian E. Clark, who seemed to do everything she could to undermine Sophia's credibility whilst propping up Linehan. She targeted Sophia on 4 main counts. 1, the fact that she used the phrase quote-unquote alarm or distress, yet didn't express this in a manner she demanded and couldn't explain where she picked up said language when asked about it. Now, District Judge Brian E. Clark notes 2 perfectly valid explanations: that she was a former police cadet, thinks scouts but for older kids and linked to the police, and that she'd been in contact with a former officer, Lindsay Watson. But because Sophia couldn't say for sure where she picked up said phrase, that apparently makes her unreliable for reasons? Keeping in mind that the police took 6 months after the initial incident to charge Linehan and that the trial took place over a year later, and this just seems to be punishing the victim for not having a perfect memory during what was an incredibly stressful period on account of, the sexual harassment, assault, and stalking? It's almost like stress has a known impact on long-term memory formation. 2. The fact that she couldn't recall police contacting her on a specific date to tell her that they wouldn't be pursuing the case. Again, remembering that this happened 11 months ago. 3. The fact that Sophia didn't remember being reluctant to give the police details on how she has some of Linehan's personal information, specifically his name, date of birth, address, and mobile number. in spite of the police asserting that she was. Thing is, she did explain whilst on the stand. Ignoring the fact that Linehan's a public figure, making his name and date of birth public information, he also did an interview with The Telegraph which contained easily identifiable photos of his flat. As for his number, it was supplied to Sophia by a burner account, remembering that Linehan has a lot of victims. Though, again, we're dealing with a child recalling events 11 months ago during a particularly traumatic period, and, let's be clear, the UK police are shit at their jobs and have a history of abusing trans people, including trans youth. Just a couple months ago, we covered a story in which trans children were brutalised by UK police, their heads smashed into window and door frames, before one child was denied multiple doses of their heart medication without being seen by a medical expert. That is how the UK legal system treats trans people, specifically trans youth. I can understand why Sophia might be hesitant or even uncooperative at the time, if she were. And lastly 4, that Sophia failed to recall exactly how many Twitter handles she had, which feels so fucking desperate that it's not even worth dignifying with a response. Just note, she did accept every single one as they were presented, a fact that will become important later. But those were the 4 points used to undermine Sophia's credibility. Meanwhile, for Linehan, the judge said the following, quote, "I generally found the defendant to be a credible witness. He was willing to make concessions, for example, when accepting that he had no evidence to back up his claim that the complainant was a sissy porn watcher, and was willing to accept which comments he regretted and which he did not. Further, he made a number of concessions which, if he was seeking to mislead the court, in my view, he would not have done. For example, but not limited to these examples, he accepted that outside of the BOI conference, the complainant was committing no offence, but said that the complainant is clever and does not commit offences. He also confirmed that he did not see the complainant harass or take photographs of anyone else outside of the BOI, but he found out about this later. The defendant is clearly firm in his views, and, as I have made clear, it is not for me to adjudicate upon whether he is right in those views or not, and conversely, whether the complainant is right in their views or not. Whilst robust in his views, I did not find that the defendant was seeking to mislead the court and appeared to be a generally frank and honest witness." End quote. I'm fucking sorry? Was District Judge Bryony Clark doing lines of cocaine before she made this ruling? Linehan repeatedly floated the conspiracy that Sophia had lied about her age, even after the courts had verified her birth and he himself had acknowledged that he knew she was 17 in his post the day after the incident. This is the guy District Judge Bryony Clark is presenting as credible. Also acknowledge how Linehan acknowledging that he was mistaken and backtracking is taken as proof of his credibility, yet Sophia doing the exact same thing with regards to her Twitter handles, that's evidence used to discredit her. Just a blatant double standard. It is infuriating to see such a horrific display of victim blaming. Every simple mistake incriminates her, yet every conspiracy exonerates him. And the evidence? Well, the evidence be fucking damned. Because District Judge Bryony Clark dismissed the first charge, namely that Linehan had harassed Sophia in approaching her at the event to sexually degrade her, tried to source her private information, and the dozens upon dozens of posts he made demonizing her to his 500,000 followers. She begins by once again attacking Sophia's apparent failure to express how she was alarmed and distressed. It doesn't matter that she presented evidence of Linehan sexually degrading her, labeling her a child groomer, and trying to source his private information. All of that was ignored. Just like the fact that Linehan constantly misgendered Sophia throughout his campaign of harassment, something he continued to do during his trial, with the ruling openly dismissing this on grounds that, whilst quote, Linehan regularly referred to Sophia with male pronouns. The complainant described this as rude, but not alarming or distressing. End quote. This would be career-shattering negligence in a just world. The harmful impact misgendering has on trans people via inducing or worsening gender dysphoria is not some great mystery. Deliberate and repeated misgendering has been ruled to legally constitute harassment in the past, and yet all precedent in medical science is ignored to instead blame the victim for their use of language. It'd be like a judge throwing out a stabbing case, since without a detailed medical explanation of how the human body works and that it generally doesn't like to have extra holes put in it, that cannot be considered bodily harm. Apparently it doesn't matter that Sophia submitted specific evidence as examples of behaviour which caused her a great deal of distress. It doesn't matter that she explicitly pointed out the risk involved with Linehan's 500,000 followers. It doesn't matter how it's pretty easy to see how most people will be distressed by any number of things Linehan did, let alone all of them. That simply gets thrown out. Sophia is abandoned by the very people who should be protecting her. Speaking of, the bullshit continues, with District Judge Brian E. Clark blaming Sophia for attending the Battle of Ideas event, claiming that it's on her since, even though she didn't know Linehan would be there, she, quote, must have known there would be a large number of people in attendance who held opposing views. End quote. Well, yeah, that was the reason for her attendance, to try and study the opposition to better counter them. The UK gender critical movement has spent years undermining Sophia's autonomy and the autonomy of her friends, actions which are already known to have taken the lives of dozens of trans children, and is part of the reason the Lincoln Institute for Genocide Prevention has issued a nationwide warning for both trans and intersex people residing in the country. Now, I agree, Sophia shouldn't have been there trying to figure out how to take on gender-critical fascists. It should have been adults, including those of the state, stepping up to protect trans youth. But they haven't. Instead, they failed entirely in their duties over the past decade, meaning that Sophia and other trans youth, such as those at Trans Kids Deserve Better, don't have the security of sitting this one out. They've been forced into a desperate situation where they are taking whatever action they can to defend themselves as part of community defense, the tier between self-defense and national defense. When a community you belong to is under attack for simply existing, you have the right to defend said community, and a part of that will require you to put yourself in harm's way, distress or none. But all of that context is just erased. This is like saying a victim who resorted to self-defense or a soldier who engaged in national defense cannot suffer PTSD. As for Sophia supposedly looking visibly happy at one point, was this after Graham Linehan, her harasser, turned away and ran after he failed in his abusive tirade, potentially leaving Sophia feeling like she had the advantage for once? She's a fucking teenager, abandoned by the adults in society, left to fight for herself, and she got in a clear win. It may not have shifted things culturally, but it probably felt really good in the moment. It probably brought the adrenaline up and made her want to press the advantage. Thing is, how does that erase Linehan's misgendering and sexual degradation of her prior to that point? How does that erase Linehan's assault and public attempts to gain access to her private information afterwards? It doesn't. Was it reckless? Potentially. Understandable? Absolutely. Especially given her age and the wider context. Distress is fight or flight, not just flight. It's not like Sophia did a Mario McLachlan and shoulder barged a completely random group at the event, like in the Hyde Park incident of 2017. And that's not just my opinion, it's Linehan's, with the ruling acknowledging that, quote, in relation to the tweet on the 22nd of October 2024, in which Linehan posted, he likes to handle people and then complain about being touched himself. Linehan said this was bad wording and he meant that Sophia likes to get in people's faces. He confirmed that he was not suggesting that Sophia touched anyone without consent and said that Sophia is very clever and never does that. End quote. Sophia is also blamed by District Judge Brian E. Clark for not reporting Linehan's post on Twitter, as if the site isn't owned by a massive anti-trans bigot and known to be apathetic to such reports, or to the police prior to her being sexually harassed and physically assaulted. This completely ignores Sophia's marginalised status and how the UK's legal system's long and sordid history of violence against trans people makes things particularly difficult and even dangerous for us to engage with it. This is a failure on part of the state, not Sophia. Yet nowhere is the fact that Linehan attempted to sexually degrade her on camera even touched upon. It is fucking sick, is what it is. Linehan was found guilty, however, of criminal damage in destroying Sophia's mobile. But this isn't due to the system taking violence against trans people seriously, but rather the fact that he confessed to doing so on Twitter, making it a charge even District Judge Brian E. Clark couldn't bullshit his way out of. And now that we covered the ruling, I feel the need to make one thing absolutely clear. And that is the fact that Sophia isn't to blame for this verdict. I don't care if she got a few things wrong, didn't do everything she should have done. She was a bloody kid at the time she got sexually abused and was barely an adult when it went to trial. She could hypothetically be the most insufferable person around, yet that still wouldn't mean that she deserved to be sexually degraded and subsequently assaulted by Linehan. That doesn't mean she deserved the harassment or the stalking that Linehan engaged in before and after. Nor does it mean she deserved all of the abuse she received from the rest of the gender critical movement, because that's another factor to consider here. It wasn't just Linehan who was abusing her, but many of his stormtroopers. You don't have to like or even know someone to be able to empathise with them in a case like this. So, in the unlikely chance that Sophia is listening to this, I just wanted to say, I am sorry that you were put through the circus only for the judge's bullshit conclusion. I had originally intended to go over the car wreck of an interview Linehan did with The Observer, only to run out of time, though I might cover it in another video. The one thing I do want to quickly touch on is the way Linehan compares himself sexually harassing and assaulting a teenage girl to, and I shit you not, soldiers in the trenches of World War I. That is how detached Linehan is from reality. Linehan has always had the luxury to stop abusing and demonizing trans people, to leave us alone, just as his wife, a woman unlike himself, begged him to do, divorcing him when he refused. Trans people don't have that privilege. For us, this is quite literally do or die. Yet, returning to his wife divorcing him, Linehan isn't doing this because he gives two shits about women. In fact, the article notes how multiple women, not just his wife, have tried to get him to stop, only for him to misogynistically tell them that he knows better. Meanwhile, the actions of him and his buddies have objectively made things worse across the UK for all women, not just trans women, even leading breast cancer survivors to be singled out and abused by people just like him. And lest we forget, gender-critical fascism, the ideology he fights to uphold, is founded on the belief that trans men are a sexual resource to be controlled, that they're actually naive young girls stolen from them by a nefarious other, with the people they list as being responsible almost always being Jewish, is why the gender-critical movement is riddled with predators, including Nicola Murray, one of their leaders and a key voice in the Supreme Court ruling which sought to exclude trans people from public life altogether, with Murray having been convicted of more than a decade of child sexual abuse. And she's not alone, as Linehan is proof of. I remember calling him out as a sexually abusive monster back in 2023, a whole year before he sexually harassed a teenage girl at a public event in front of all his peers, several of whom defended his actions in court. But back in 2023, Linehan stole photos of a trans person's genitals and published them to Twitter without their consent. That should have been enough to have him thrown out of civilized society, but the fact is, gender-critical fascism isn't civilized. It's cruel and monstrous. If they ejected sexual predators, they'd lose 90% of their members, maybe more, including their leaders. I'm actually getting ready to work on a video about gender-critical predators to highlight just how normalized this is. Meanwhile, Sophia, the actual victim in all this, has had to deal with being made into one of the most hated and targeted minority groups in the UK. She's had to live through 2 targeted attacks on trans youth healthcare in recent years, constantly being labelled a predator for simply existing, and now being sexually degraded and assaulted by this fucking creep. And yet, I'm not going to compare Sophia to a soldier, because she isn't. Soldiers receive training. She's just trying to exist whilst fighting for her and her friends' survival. She might not always get things right, but she's doing a hell of a lot more than most. Though, what do you think? What are your thoughts on Linehan's attempts to sexually degrade Sophia? What are your thoughts on District Judge Brian E. Clark's verdict? Would you like to share any words of support for Sophia? Did you notice something I missed? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And if you appreciate what we do here and want to help keep us running, please consider becoming one of the wonderful patrons who make our work possible. You can also make a one-time donation via PayPal or Super Thanks on YouTube. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following people: Matthew Kovac, Flynn, Bo Ayer, Deborah Goldsmith, Higgins the Seagull, Jackie Sins, Mix Alba, and Peter Cole. And for myself, Adita and Levi, take care now.